The last left-wing party has cucked. The world is at war.
Well, everyone, welcome back to this fourth and well overdue installment of the Chatted Up podcast. I'm your host, Peter Leva, recording from El Paso, Texas, and my guest with me here, who I will simply refer to by the alias MOP, is a paleoconservative member of the alt-right. Yes, you heard me right. The alt-right, a movement whose people generally consist of fascists, monarchists, or religious authoritarians, also has the occasional libertarian or occasional not crazy conservative. So I'll just call you M. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good myself. Enjoying the fact that school hasn't quite started yet. It's about to. So before we sort of get into the hard stuff or any of the technical stuff, describe yourself to people. You know, your life, your interests, how you came to get the views that you kind of did.
Well, I will say I was raised in a Christian home. I'm a very strict Christian myself, though I wish I could be better. Especially since I'm pretty strict with myself.
Don't we all?
Oh,
man?
yes.
I'm a Christian too.
Ironically, I would say I practically grew up under the political influence from my parents at first, seeing as how the first election I remember was the Bush election back in, I'd say, 2000, and I was rooting for Bush, and I'd say then I was too young to vote, but then basically rooting for the Republican side, though it was only during 2008 with the unfortunate election of Obama that I actually began to become more involved in politics. And what I read in U.S. civics was that one should get involved lest we lose our freedom. And then I joined the Tea Party in 2010, but some of them even had some conspiracy theorists, and I ended up getting my hopes up for Romney, but after that failed, and after I discovered that Romney was practically a traitor to so many of his values, like he was secretly for gay marriage, I lost a lot of trust in the Republican Party, and I didn't seem to trust Trump until after he was elected and jobs started coming back. And as a matter of fact, so much of what I have come to believe has come from history, especially history of the Roman Empire, the British Empire, all throughout Europe, and even America.
That's interesting because the first election I remember was also the 2000 Bush versus Gore election. I was only 6 years old. I didn't know hardly anything about politics. I just knew that it couldn't be Gore. It had to be Bush. And then 2004, Yeah, kind of, sort of the same thing. I didn't know a whole lot about politics. I just knew that the other people had to be wrong. It couldn't be. It absolutely couldn't be. Who the hell was it running against Bush in '04 again? John Kerry. I think the only thing I really knew about John Kerry is that he was pro-choice, and that was like the only thing I sort of could pin him on, or the fact that he wanted to like end the Iraq War.
Same with me.
Yeah, I kind of didn't really know much. But yeah, once Obama came along, funnily enough, I also decided to start becoming more politically active because something deep down told me, hey, I can't just have a surface level understanding of these issues. I got to start, doing a little bit more research. I mean, that didn't really come full swing until sort of post 2012, because even in 2012 I very much had a normie understanding of politics. I did have hope for the Tea Party, even though it's funny, a lot of people associate the Tea Party as sort of a Republican movement. It kind of wasn't. It was more of a general libertarian uprising within the American populace. I mean, the movement was called Taxed Enough already, and there were Democrats who were part of it. But basically, the movement got co-opted by fanatical Christians and ended up becoming smeared as nothing more than an anti-gay marriage movement, which it was never supposed to be. So basically, by year's end, it became the punchline of the joke. And then along came the George Soros-funded copycats plus more weed, known as Occupy Wall Street, which is kind of a shit show of its own, and nothing really came of it. So come this election cycle is when I started really diving off the deep end. So it's kind of funny how we both parallel each other in that regard. I mean, I assume you were pretty young around the 2000 election as well.
Oh yes, I was pretty young at the time.
Yeah, and looking back, I'm like, yeah, why was I pro-Bush? Why was I ever pro-Romney either? I mean, to be fair, we didn't have very good alternatives, but, what are you going to do?
Yes, and the Reform Party had little to no chance of even making it to the ballot, I'd say.
Yeah, going third party out of spite for the establishment, unless you can get a significant portion of the population to actually do it, it's kind of a worthless gesture and pretty much has a chance of screwing over the lesser of two evils.
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, that's what threw off the 1992 election and ended up getting the awful president Bill Clinton in. And because of him, we ended up getting NAFTA, which then made mass immigration like 4 times as large.
Oh, fun fact, by the way, if you want to blame anyone for the housing crisis, blame the Clintons. It goes farther back than Obama, farther back than the Bushes. It goes, or than GW. It goes back to the Clinton era policies. So blame him for 2008, basically. Bush Jr. sort of agitated it, and then Obama really pushed it over the edge. So, yeah, Clinton sucked ass. That's all I can say. It was Ross Perot, right, who was the guy who sort of threw things off?
Oh, yes, Ross Perot.
Yeah, I don't know any of the guy's policies, to be honest. I just know that a lot of people point to him as like a decent third-party candidate frequently, kind of up there with... did he run an independent or libertarian? I forget.
Actually, I think he ran as an independent.
Okay, so he ran independent. Yeah. So from your so I don't know if it was yeah, I think it was you who shared this. So from your political compass test, you can probably best be described as a paleo-conservative, similar kind of vein as Pat Buchanan, Rand Paul, the sort of more free market conservative and socially pretty libertarian. What exactly does paleo-conservatism mean to you?
Well, I would say it means preserving Christian values and also making sure that we protect the liberty that allows us to protect our Christian values, because the corruption goes so deep that it's not going to be solved by politics, but a reform in the culture. Because as the scriptures say, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear their cry and heal their land.
Yeah, and that actually echoes a sentiment that I think very much that Christians need to also apply to politics as well. It's Matthew 6, 24 through 35, I believe is the passage. It's the one talking. It's the one that basically ends by saying, don't ask, what will I eat, what will I drink, where will I sleep? These thoughts fill the minds of non-believers. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be granted unto you. That instead of getting bogged down in minutia, take care of the basics first. Because if the basics aren't in place, you're right. The liberties we have on paper will eventually mean nothing. The more that Washington gets corrupted by anything from bureaucracy to the deep state to the sort of coastal elite patterns that we see in California, New York. It's funny.
Oh, yes.
It's funny, the Founding Fathers specifically tried to perfect representative democracy or a republic to forever prevent the rise of an aristocracy. And sure enough, we still wound up with an aristocracy. People who all went to the same schools, the same poli-sci classes, they all worked for their senators, they all worked their way up the political ladder, and then one random celebrity business dude comes in and blows them the hell out. And they're all scrambling to figure out what just happened.
And I think that's basically the fail-safe that happened there. And it wasn't the first time in history that the elites ended up coming around and corrupting things, which is how Andrew Jackson came along. And the press and so many others painted such a negative image of him that basically, when he was elected, they mockingly called him King Andrew the First.
Well, there you go. Even as far back as 1820, I guess we somehow had already started to develop an aristocracy. And then, of course, you see these people decrying things like the Electoral College, being like, "Oh, it gives way too much power to places that don't have anyone living there." I'm like, yes. That's exactly why it was founded. I don't know where I saw this, but it's like what 2/3 of America is located in only 3 cities. Isn't that just insane?
Oh, yes. And basically, people would only be able to cater to those 3 cities were the Electoral College abolished, and the rest of the country would be ignored.
Oh, exactly. It's like all you got to really do is, if we had no fail safe like the Electoral College, all you'd really have to do is just cater to the vacuous whims of the huge metropolitan cities. Say, hey, these other unwashed masses want to take all your stuff away. Vote for us and we'll stop them.
Exactly. And I think a lot of the support for the Electoral College and the realization that is coming back in this anti-egalitarian wake-up, this is what prompted much of the alt-right, the alt-light, and more paleoconservatism. This movement, of course, was known as the Dark Enlightenment. Have you heard of the Dark Enlightenment?
I've heard of the expression the Dark Enlightenment, but I have never known what it meant.
Well, I myself consider myself a Dark Enlightenment thinker, especially since the more I saw the corruption of the system that people were abusing, the more I started to think that we've gone too far egalitarian.
I'd very much agree. I certainly used to be a little more egalitarian in my thinking, in that, my line of reasoning was, okay, we're all created in God's image, equality, all this airy-fairy stuff. But the more I really thought about it, yeah, our a lot of our systems, a lot of our laws, a lot of our institutions very much give at this point in the 21st century. I think it's fair to say affirmative action has pretty much no purpose anymore except for the poor. Like let's say the poor getting into university. Beyond that, do we really need things that quote unquote level out the playing field anymore? Is anyone really so institutionally oppressed? And I'm not talking the conspiracy theory of the social justice left, of everything from cis heteronormative patriarchal society, all this nonsensical postmodern jargon. Is anyone really truly withheld from opportunities? If you want it bad enough, are you totally incapable of achieving it? No. And while I can't call myself a paleoconservative per se, I certainly lean that way now more than not. I've abandoned the whole foreign intervention, Iraq war kind of stuff. I've abandoned that entirely. Libya was kind of the big wake-up call for me for that. Syria almost could have been. I've certainly become a little more against social safety nets. I can't say I want to get rid of them all, but certainly they need reform whether people like them or not. Some, I agree, need to be axed entirely. And then there was one thing that Rand Paul brought up that started my sort of libertarian streak, which was the whole gay marriage issue, where Rand Paul was like, why is the government involved in marriage at all? Should that not be a social thing? And I started following a lot more center-left people on YouTube, some more libertarians, other centrists, center-right people. And the perspective, a lot of them had very libertarian perspectives on things. So I've grown to appreciate libertarians and paleoconservatives a lot more. Especially looking at the history of the neoconservatives. I mean, are you familiar with
yes.
Well, what do you know about the neocons and where they came from?
Well, anyways, the neoconservatives basically are about catering to spreading the nation's values by imposing it on other nations, even by military intervention if need be. And so much of this leans more to the left, almost practically center-right, almost smack dab in the center. And as a matter of fact, so many things they have to do basically would violate their own principles of conservatism, especially when it comes to immigration. And as far as conserving anything, these guys conserve nothing, which is why the term cuck-servative is popular among the alt-right. And people like the Bushes, they were soft on immigration. They even bailed out the banks, which was really a foolish thing to do because that only made the economy worse. Kind of like Herbert Hoover when he ended up bailing out the banks and it made the economy worse, which cost him the election to FDR. Basically, Herbert Hoover and FDR were the precursor to Bush and Obama, if you follow me. And sadly, so much of this neoconservatism is now the norm among the Tory party in the United Kingdom with David Cameron and Theresa May. And in fact, they will practically stand up for basically nothing except for limited spending and fiscal conservatism.
And weird and oddly specific social policies like fox hunting.
Oh, yes.
Dear Lord, man, I do not know what's become of I do not know what's become of the British Conservative Party. I mean, I'm not an expert on British politics, but after sort of following them a little bit closer for the last year, especially once I started following YouTuber Sargon of Akkad, who has to be one of my favorites, Yeah, the Tory party kind of doesn't know what the hell they're doing. Excuse me, at this point. But do you know where the neocons came from? Like the actual origins of their ideology?
I would have to look up on that.
Well, I can actually tell you right now, and it might give you even worse opinions of them. Are you interested?
Go ahead.
Alrighty, so believe it or not, there kind of was no one conservative party in America for the longest time. There were socially conservative Democrats right up through the 70s. There were socially conservative Republicans right up to the 70s. Basically, for the first half of the 20th century, you could say, yeah, America was pretty much dominated by center-left progressivism. You know, the only thing that really distinguished the two parties basically was that the Republican Party for the longest time was the pro-business party, and then the Democrat Party had segregation and and racist stuff basically written into their books. But otherwise,
Nothing's changed.
What's up?
Nothing's changed.
Well, there you go. They keep to their roots. But basically, there were a bunch of dissident Trotskyite communists in America, or I guess ex-Trotskyites. I mean, they were still socialists, but they'd fled the Soviet Union. They realized what a tyrannical state it had become under Stalinist philosophy. And being Trotskyists, one of the doctrines of Trotskyism is a little something called permanent war. Now, it's going to sound even better once I explain it. So, Leon Trotsky, or should I say Lev Bronstein, yes, Trotsky was a Jew. Trotsky's idea for making communism work globally was that all countries needed to have either simultaneously or one by one communist revolutions to forever destroy any threat to communism, because we saw from things like the Paris Commune that non-Stalinist communist, communes couldn't survive very long because they were always destroyed by outside forces or subverted from within. So Trotsky's thing was, okay, the whole communism can't work until the whole world adopts it. So his strategy was permanent war. That was the thinking of these dissident American ex-Trotskyites. They became disenchanted with the New Left in the 60s when the New Left came out as the anti-war party, as the anti-Vietnam War party, because these Trotskyites were hawkish. They realized they'd no longer have any home in the Democrat Party, so they made an exodus to the Republican Party, and they were able to entrench their hawkish beliefs and hawkish attitudes there. So basically, they were a bunch of former socialists who still couldn't wrap their minds around policies that didn't somehow involve a heavy-handed government and foreign intervention. It seems that the commies can't stop ruining everything. Am I right?
Tell me about it.
The commies ruined the Democrat Party by turning them into social justice warriors, and then the commies ruined the Republican Party by turning them into neoconservatives. And you wonder why neoconservatives get along so well with the Democrat establishment. I mean, honestly, what are the meaningful differences between a neoconservative and a progressive? There's literally an old saying that goes, neocons want the exact same thing that progressives do, just 20 years late and a little bit less of it.
Oh, I've never heard that before, but I believe it.
That's why McCain gets along so well with the Dems.
Oh, yes. I even saw a picture of him with Bernie Sanders. And funny thing is, I even saw an alternated picture of that with them as Statler and Waldorf from The Muppet Show.
That is a hilarious parallel right there. Oh, gosh. So, So you wonder why the paleocons didn't end up being the majority of the party. Well, you know what National Review is, right? The neoconservative magazine.
Oh, never heard of it.
Oh, well, there you go. That's what we get for growing up in the digital age. We don't know a lot of the bases, the on paper bases for our movements. Basically, National Review started as a conservative magazine. I mean, you've at least heard the name William F. Buckley, right? Bill Buckley. He's sort of one of the big historical conservative icons.
Well, frankly, I haven't really heard of him.
Well, I don't know much about him either, to be fair. But basically, the early sort of paleoconservatives were actually part of the John Birch Society, you know, which had set it up as it set itself up as an American anti-communist organization, and it's still around today, the John Birch Society. And it was actually named for an American missionary who was shot by communists in China in 1945. And basically, Buckley saw them as way too much a liability for his conservative magazine because they actually had principles that they were unwavering on, and it didn't help that they were kind of conspiracy nuts themselves. The early paleocons, you know, things like water fluorination, etc. They were against, and basically, Bill Buckley was able to kick them out of National Review, and instead replaced them with a bunch of ex-leftists to become senior writers, including prominent 1930s Trotskyite James Burnham, longtime Communist Party USA member Frank Meyer, and former Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers. Just a bunch of wonderful people went to work for National Review, and that was basically where the neocon paleocon split came from. And let's just say once I learned that, it terrified me of the neocons. And you use the word cuckservative, which is funny because I've actually been reading a book called Cuckservative, How Quote-Unquote Conservatives Betrayed America. It's by John Red Eagle and Vox Day, and the foreword's by Mike Cernovich. So that's actually where I learned that stuff. Thoughts on the neocons now?
Well, I would say they certainly are good at only one thing, and that is compromise. It's a wonder how we were able to fall for them for so long.
Well, they passed themselves off as the patriots by being war hawks. And of course, just paying basic lip service to patriotism. They named a policy to spy on us all the Patriot Act. I mean, how could you be against something called the Patriot Act? Am I right?
Oh, yes. And really, that is basically an intrusion on the right of privacy.
Mm-hmm. And given your paleoconservative and therefore more libertarian leanings, I imagine you have... It gives you pause, let's just say.
Oh, yes. I would certainly equate the neocons as more like Mussolini.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're corporatists. And what is fascism? Fascism is basically state socialism plus hypernationalism. You know, socialism with a different collective. So.
Oh, yes.
So it's funny, they want to call us principled conservatives fascists, but who are the ones who are actually advocating for corporatism?
Oh my goodness.
So how exactly did you find yourself part of the alt-right? Like, being a paleoconservative is one thing, but what exactly drove you to the alt-right?
Well, I ended up getting in many debates about the alt-right and the relativism of race and ideology, and as a matter of fact, All too often, I've seen America scarred by the racial identity. I was wondering what even made the civil rights era active and play a part in the first place, and that was the Christian principles that all men are created equal in the image of God. And so, anyways, basically that's what was able to ease off high racial tensions. But the problem there was the fact that Lyndon B. Johnson was secretly a member of the KKK, as what was released in the JFK files when Trump released them. You remember that?
Dude, I remember that. I was so, maybe not horrified, because I'd already watched Dinesh D'Souza's Hillary's America, so I knew that LBJ, had basically secretly sort of plotted against racial minorities. And then from the JFK files to find out, LBJ was an ex-Klansman. I'm like, okay, that makes a little bit too much sense. It's funny. The big three progressive heroes, I guess, quote unquote, Wilson, FDR, and LBJ, they just couldn't stop catering to racists, if not, in the case of Wilson and LBJ, be outright racists.
And then basically, that was basically the birth of identity politics in its infancy, the cultural Marxism, if you follow me. And thus equality became less about equality of merit and equality of opportunity, and more about equality of outcome between race, between class, between gender, etc., etc. And the unfortunate thing now is the civil rights era, I would say, hit too late in American history. And as a matter of fact, that was also when the hippies movement, basically the hyper-left, over-sexualized lifestyle, started corrupting America. And with it, things started going downhill. And now you see, basically, out-of-wedlock birth rates for all ethnicities has skyrocketed. For us non-Hispanic whites, it's up to like 1 out of 4 non-Hispanic whites are now born as bastards, and up to 53% of Hispanics born as bastards. And for the blacks,
it's like 3/4 for them. It's insane.
Oh yes, and that's the big problem, because so many of these people will end up growing up in fatherless homes. Although a small portion of them don't grow up in fatherless homes, I'd say the majority of them do, which leaves them prone to desperation. It leaves them prone to depending on the government, thus leaning more towards the left and leaning more towards big government policies, or even getting involved in gang life and crime. And thus, society becomes more destabilized. And as a matter of fact, when they end up rather blaming other races, like blaming whites for all their problems, it drives people to their primitive natures. Basically our sin nature only reveals the worst in us. And even for many godly black people nowadays, they see themselves as victims, sadly. And unless there is spiritual revival, I'd say the only options would be to maintain the demographics as they are. Otherwise, America could fall apart just like Yugoslavia. I hate to say that it may need to be a case of bringing back segregation or an apartheid system, but if that is the case, then we might need to do that. But I'm not just talking in favor of one race over another, but basically separation of everyone except those who were already intermarried, for they will be the exception, except for areas which they really open and embrace diversity, like New York City and areas in California. Much of this, I ended up getting this thought from Jared Taylor, another paleo.
I was going to ask, yeah, what you were proposing sounded very Jared Taylorish. I found myself listening to more of his speeches, and yeah, he's kind of a weird specimen too, being a paleocon himself, but being sort of debatably alt-right himself, saying that people should be allowed to self-segregate organically, get rid of anti-discrimination laws, and let people naturally balkanize so that they don't feel pressured, so they don't feel demographically pressured into associating with people that they don't want to associate with. And they do it on their terms, on their time, and on their dime.
And one time I ended up saying that if this gets worse, then even minorities will begin to turn against each other. My one error is the fact that I neglected the fact that in some areas they already have, like in Pat Buchanan's book, Suicide of a Superpower, among some of the highest hate crimes there are not against whites, but blacks versus Hispanics.
I can tell you I can tell you right here and now, being a Hispanic and living here on the border, I can tell you from actual experience, blacks and Mexicans hate each other. They hate, well, they either absolutely love each other or absolutely hate each other. Like, if a Mexican chick brings home a black boyfriend, oh gosh, there'll be hell to pay. And vice versa. You know, so on and so forth. Like blacks and Hispanics, especially Mexican Hispanics, do not get along at all. So I can totally believe that.
Oh, yes. If you hold on for a minute. Okay, are we back?
Yeah. Did you move to somewhere quieter?
Oh, yes. Just my dinner was prepared and I got a little bit.
Alrighty.
And
sorry, where were we? Oh yeah, the fact that blacks
the
and
conflicts
hate each
between
other.
blacks and Hispanics, which is why, unfortunately, I would have to say I am rather against interracial marriage, which is pretty painful to me to say that, especially since I've even had one date with an Asian girl. But if basically they believe to be excommunicated by both sides of society, then it's only going to cause more division and more tension, and I certainly don't want more families to be torn apart in this particular dark era.
Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of arguments against interracial marriage, and funnily enough, my grandpa, like my very Mexican grandpa, he doesn't even like interracial marriage. You know, his perspective is that when you marry someone, you're not only marrying that person, you're linking two entire families together, and if they can't communicate, let alone even get along, you know, is it really worth it? I mean, I'm not willing to let go of my more individualistic side and say, well, too bad, you know, people will associate with who they will associate with, but I sort of take the Jared Taylor approach, and that's that I think if you leave things alone organically, most people stick to their own race anyway. Most people are attracted to people who look similar to them. That's actually facial shape. Apparently, especially nose, if I'm not mistaken. But my thing is organic systems, which is why I've actually grown to kind of like Jared Taylor, in that rather than take a, say, Richard Spencer approach and make everything very heavy-handed government solution, you know, ethnically cleanse peacefully or otherwise a country, and then mandate and slowly outlaw things like interracial marriage and whatnot. I'm kind of a proponent of the fact. I'm kind of a proponent of freedom of association because I think most people do it anyway. And one solution I've never heard the alt-right suggest very often at all is that white people just need to start having more babies. In which case, I'm something you mentioned earlier, the sexual revolution. I think the sexual revolution was like the worst thing to ever happen. It's what ruined relationships between men and women. It's what made women unhappy by making them want to somehow try to have it all, like Nikki Haley. Not everyone can be the CEO of a corporation and a mother, and most women are happiest being mothers. Society would be better off if a majority of women still saw their primacy role as being mothers, and if fathers were the breadwinners. Not all, obviously, but I think that those are generally the roles that, well, God created us to actually have. And one problem I see in the whole white community, if you will, is that in Europe and America, white birth rates have plummeted. It's to the point where most majority white nations will become minority white by 2050?
Yep.
And in which case, what you mentioned, which is what, are you familiar with the Turner Diaries?
Oh, I've never heard of them.
Well, basically, the Turner Diaries were a series of short stories eventually compiled in a book written by this guy, William Luther Pierce, a prominent white nationalist in the 80s, I believe. And basically, it's a dystopian future novel where after, sort of global nuclear war, by that time, blacks and Jews are the majority of America. And they use anti-racism as their excuse to bully around white people. Blacks and Jews can do no wrong, and whites can do no right. And this group of fictional characters, because of this, this blatant, disgusting double standard against them, form this underground, I guess, neo-Nazi group that plans on overthrowing the government. And the Oklahoma City building bombing?
Oh, yes.
That guy had a copy of the Turner Diaries in his car. He'd read that book. He was terrified of what a future like that might look like. And it led a man to go commit basically mass murder. And I'm not one of those guilt by association people. I don't think reading Mein Kampf is going to turn into an awful person. I want to read Mein Kampf. In fact, I actually got both of Mussolini's books right here next to me. I'm looking to read into them. But the Turner Diaries kind of future, where what happens when a historically, formerly oppressed group becomes the majority, and they've been stirred up, whipped up into a frenzy, and when they take power, they're going to use it to bully the whole white man to no end, and nobody will stand up against them. That's the big fear that the alt-right has. And unlike most people who dismiss the alt-right movement as racist, I actually have a lot of sympathies with the alt-right. I've always gotten along better with white people myself. I mean, if you heard my voice and didn't see my face, would you assume I was Hispanic at all?
I'd assume you were non-Hispanic white or Hispanic white.
What part of the country would you assume I'd be from?
That's difficult to say because I've always been terrible with regional accents.
Oh, okay, well, I'm here in El Paso, Texas. So I'm in far west Texas, and I'm right on the border with Mexico. So I've talked to a guy from Minnesota, who had a very obvious Minnesota accent, and he said I sounded a little bit Texan. But point being is that I have no affinity, no love no connection to Mexico. It's always been right across the river from me, but I was never raised in the culture. I've been surrounded by it, but never raised it. I was always raised on the more American side of the city. You know, the more American culture, entertainment, food, so on and so forth. I mean, I did have, you know, my share of, you know, enrichment, I guess you could say, in Mexican culture, but, you know, I've always identified more with, you know, I guess white America. And I don't dismiss the alt-right out of hand. I think they have legitimate fears. I've seen the vitriol and the hatred that minorities can have, especially with, you know, to use the colloquial expression, as cringy as it might be to some people, cultural Marxism. People being whipped up into this frenzy of oppressor versus oppressed. That, you can't make that fear go away, especially not when the New York Times, Huffington Post, Salon, Vox, so on and so forth, et al., ad infinitum, are all writing articles about how much or how about people should go around killing white people, or it's a good thing that whites are soon going to be the minority, or white people ruined this, or white people ruined that, or white people are XYZ problem. You know, it's a legitimate it's a legitimate fear. And you know, I can definitely see where that fear comes from. And once you add the Christian perspective in of how people no longer see each other, despite their differences, as people made in God's image, but rather as mortal enemies with competing interests, that's a pretty volatile situation.
Oh, yes, definitely. Which is when I basically wouldn't see whites being heavily oppressed, but more like us turning up like Yugoslavia, because in 2050, basically every race would be a minority. No one holding above 50% of the population. All the racists among whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians would take up the gun and shoot each other down, and many innocents among them would die.
And then to make it even weirder, there'd be blacks who'd be like, well, I'm not siding with the blacks. I'm going to go protect my white friends. Or, oh, I'm a Hispanic. I'm not going to side against the blacks. I'm going to go join the blacks. You know, so if you think about it, it wouldn't even be a proper race war. It'd just be a giant shit show. You know, there'd be vague alliances and vague factions. But could you imagine the more sensible people in the middle? You know, or you maybe have your sensible people in the middle who just always have a sniper out the window, and that the instant they see any of the armies, they just shoot them indiscriminately. Like it'd be an insane future if anyone were to ever attempt an actual race war.
No, it'd be terrible.
So I don't know. It's kind of interesting. You don't exactly meet a lot of non-authoritarians in the alt-right, so you're definitely an interesting specimen as far as I'm concerned, because most American alt-righters seem to be fascists, whereas a lot of the religious authoritarians and monarchists, a lot of them seem to be relegated to Europe. And I've seen you get bullied before by like actual legit racists. I mean, what's that like?
Well, I tell you, it makes me surprised when the leftists and even social justice warriors who've basically even gone for Trump would call me a racist when I'm calling out a select handful of racists that are particularly among the Jews. And I'm thinking, how is it that they have called me the racist one when these people are equating all Jews, basically saying all of this, it's because of their ethnicity that they're all against us. And some of this growing white supremacy is also why I'm concerned, especially because of a bit of my ancestry. I even have a bit of Native American blood in me, so And with my skin being able to tan so easily, some people have even mistaken me as not being white at all. And basically, I don't want to be caught in the middle between white supremacists and anti-white social justice warriors.
Yeah, you certainly tread a very interesting line. I've seen a lot of I've seen some of the instances. Again, I'm not going to say where you're from because I don't want to give it away and send a bunch of people, harassing you and or me or doxing either one of us, whatever. But yeah, I've seen that kind of vitriol where you got some people calling you racist and other ones calling you cucks because you won't call out, them niggers or them spicks,
Oh yes, tell me about it.
And honestly, I've been interested to hear more specifics about the Jewish question because I never knew what it was about. And then I come to find out apparently the reason why Hitler didn't like Jews was because of a bunch of East European communist Jews constantly trying to overthrow Germany's government during the 1920s. I mean, the Weimar Republic is the example people point to where you have Nazis and communists fighting in the streets and switching sides because they were both socialists and they were sort of reciprocally, if that's a word, convincing each other of their arguments. And Weimar Republic was kind of crazy because of it. But Hitler didn't like Jews because he thought they were the ones promoting all the communism, all the degeneracy, I guess you could say, and then using the newspapers and the banks to harass German nationalists. And that's why Hitler rose to power. Hitler did not rise to power in a vacuum. He had reasons to. So the Jewish question, it's a very, very interesting one. The last guy I interviewed was a fascist. He didn't like Jews himself. But what's your take on it? You've said very interesting things about the Jewish community with regards to the JQ. Was Hitler onto something? Was it maybe only a small set of bad actors that seems to constantly be trying to screw things up? Is it malice or is it mass ignorance, on the part of Western Jews that they can't seem to stop screwing with people?
Well, yes, and at the same time a substantial no, because I would say Hitler was the social justice warrior of his day, because I ended up watching like the first half of The Eternal Jew for educational purposes, and there were some cherry-picked things to equate all Jews to. For example, the Babylonian Talmud ends up explaining the Goyim, aka Gentiles, as beasts, and basically those worthy of death if they strike a Jew on the jaw. And basically, they would also be granted permission to cheat the Gentiles in the Talmud, even though that was forbidden in the Torah, the Old Testament law. But as a matter of fact, as it said in Revelation 2:9, as many of these Jews had derived from the same cult that crucified Jesus, the Sanhedrin. In Revelation 2:9 it said, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. And as Martin Luther quoted on The Jews and Their Lies, said, therefore be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues, nothing is found but a den of devils in which sheer self-glory, conceit, lies, blasphemy, and defaming of God and men are practiced most maliciously and beheming in his eyes on them. But as a matter of fact, many Jews had actually begun to go...
You froze up. Sorry, you froze up for a bit there. There you are. Sorry.
Are you there?
Yeah, you froze up for a while. Sorry, repeat all that.
Well, where did I leave off?
Something the Jews were starting to what?
Well, many of the Jews were starting to go secular, like non-believers. Many of them were, of course, known as the Hiloni, the secular Jews. Those who basically they claim to uphold both the Torah and the Talmud, I would say are the Haredi. I ended up coming in contact with a Jew who was Dati. He said he was not super strict, and he said that the Talmud was not law, but simply a conversation between rabbis. And I would say the Masorti, what we know in the United States as conservative Jewish tradition, and they are not so strict when it comes to the Talmud, but would actually be open to it with education. And as a matter of fact, I first had my eyes opened on the Jewish issue when I was in Israel and been given a tour by a Palestinian Christian who's turned Israeli because his land had been taken by Israel. And as a matter of fact, so many of the Israeli army actually had to be there to defend the Palestinians from Jewish extremists. But because of these extremists, and because Hitler left out the fact that the Reform Jews wanted to do away with the Talmud altogether, he ended up saying, this is what all Jews are like. Basically, the same narrative that Black Lives Matter is pushing about white people, they're all genetically racist. Same narrative that the cultural Marxists are pushing about white people. Hitler pushed about anybody with any relation to Jews at all, which basically, even if you were Karaite, who basically don't even uphold the Talmud, you'd have gone into the concentration camps. And basically, I view Nazism as the same, as basically the other side of the same coin. Basically, the same issue of godlessness, from which then in multiracial societies like Nazi Germany, the minorities found themselves in a heap of trouble, especially since Germany had since lost so much of their Christian origins and been so corrupted in their thinking by the so-called Enlightenment. And as a matter of fact, Hitler said in his secret talks that Christianity and Judaism he said that Christianity and National Socialism couldn't exist side by side in the future, and that atheism was a return to the state of an animal, which is why basically he and his secret guard, or supreme guard, the SS, led by Himmler, they were neo-pagans, and often many of them would practice neo-pagan rituals.
That's interesting.
From which I also noticed that these same occultists basically even turn on each other nowadays for power to a seat of ruling the world when there is no seat of ruling the world. Because even Freemasons, who are an occultic group, were thrown into the concentration camps. So it baffles me how some people ignore this fact, and what's even scarier is that the Holocaust has been an excuse of white guilt for so long that it has made people deaf to the fact that the Holocaust ever happened, when one thing they ignore is that Hitler tried to exterminate an entire white ethnicity, and that was the Eastern European Slavs, and so many of them from Poland and Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly.
Composed up to
he hated Poles.
22.
He hated Poles, he hated Ukrainians, he hated Slavs, he hated Gypsies. You know, he hated, well, Jews, he hated, you know, homosexuals and other people he deemed as degenerates. It wasn't just the Jews.
Oh, yes. And if there's anybody, I would say, had a more sensible approach to said Jewish problem, it would have to be Francisco Franco in Spain. As a matter of fact, he and Hitler ended up losing common ground, seeing as how Francisco Franco was more about defending Catholicism and Christian tradition and national interests of Spain, and he even stopped an outbreak of Jewish persecution in Spanish Morocco.
Well, there you go. And it's funny, a lot of people mislabel Franco as a fascist. He was not a fascist. He was a Catholic, pro-monarchist reactionary. That's it. You know, he didn't institute a whole giant host of massive social programs, or, you know, or apparently he did nationalize a couple of industries or companies, but it's Franco was kind of a mixed bag economically, but he certainly wasn't a fascist, and it really irritates me when people try to label him as one. And yeah, he used the Nazis for some things, but then he ended his connections with them when they were of no further use.
Tell me about it. So much ignorance is basically used by the cultural Marxists, some few in the alt-right, and even a few in the alt-light as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how a lot of people don't know their own history, and it really irritates me when people use the expression "the far right" and they're referring to Nazis. I'm like, no, I am not going to accept Nazis in the right. Nazis don't belong to the right or the left. They were born from the left, as in they were born from socialists, but they did not want to go all the way commie. They saw value in nationalism and in a natural world order. So essentially, Nazis are leftist in economics, but socially conservative. So they kind of don't belong anywhere. And they certainly don't belong to the right. If you want to talk far right, you're far right. You're a paleo-conservative. You're very free market-oriented and freedom of association-oriented. That's the far right. The far right are paleo-conservatives, minarchist libertarians, anarcho-capitalist libertarians, and then you're really super rare neoliberal dictators like Augusto Pinochet, Alberto Fujimori, you know, so on and so forth, the South American anti-communist dictators. So no, I will always and forever refuse to accept Nazis as part of the right. They may be anti-communist, but that's not because they're right-wing. But anyway, yeah, that was sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. No, it's really interesting because I always wondered for the longest time what that connection between neo-paganism and the Nazis were. Because I knew the Nazis didn't like Christians, and they openly tried to subvert Catholics and Protestants and turn them against each other. Like, I actually did a report on this. Like, Hitler did not like Christians either. He saw them as a threat.
It's very clever. And it does my heart good to see that many people are actually diving into history and actually learning, and just going around and repeating it.
Yeah, it's amazing what people don't know. And it's what's made me switch majors to history, because just as the social justice left had their long march through the institutions, I think it's high time the conservatives and libertarians did too. So let's just say that Dr. Jordan Peterson is only going to be the first of many. You know, conservatives need to start joining the institutions if they want to have any effect.
Exactly.
So, thoughts on race and IQ? Also, as a sort of side note, where would I, a Hispanic conservative with, no, like I said, no ties to or affections for Mexico, where would I belong in the society that you'd envision? You know, how would other patriotic minorities fit into such a society? You know, like, and I guess further expand upon your thoughts on race mixing. You know, the race and IQ question, as well as the multiracialism question.
Well, I would say that race and IQ really, there's nothing to say that one race has a higher IQ than others, because here's the weird part. There are actually some blacks who are like smarter than some Asians. Plus, I've even seen black doctors, Hispanic doctors. And plus, the black Americans have a higher IQ than the blacks in Africa, and I could only assume that this is cultural. And the West, since the different events like the Carolingian Renaissance, the 12th century Renaissance, the Italian and Northern European Renaissance, and the Information Age, all being attributed to Western ability to learn, first passed down by the Catholic Church to the lords and merchants, and then allowing the universities to rise up. The issue of IQ, I'd say, is more on the lines of culture and people being born into said culture. And so many of the Asians who have a high IQ in America is because this is a tradition that their parents brought back from the Far East with them, and that is they prize academics very high. And in Hawaii, it's practically Asian majority there. I ended up feeling the higher strictness on academia, because then you couldn't get below an 80% in my high school or it's a fail. Not like 70 or like below 70 is a fail. Anything below 80 was a fail in this one. And so basically I would have to say so much of this is dependent on the culture in which they grow up, but this also is important because I think we need to put a hold on immigration and only accept like immigration from places with high IQs from which to better people of all races that are already here before we take on any more. And for patriots like you, if we can help solve the racial tensions, I'd say you could be the spokesman to Hispanics, I could be the spokesman to whites, or even we be the spokesman to others who are speaking on our behalf, basically. And basically you'd be the one to help us build a bridge of understanding, or at least keep the peace if separation becomes needed.
And you wouldn't envision attempting to, well, I mean, you mentioned that you're not someone who believes in deporting people who are necessarily already here, or race mixed couples who are already here, because they'd kind of be the exception. But you'd prevent, if things got extreme enough, future immigration from certain places if need be.
Oh yes. Basically, if they came legally, there's no deportation against them. Those who are illegally here, I'm already against. I was against them being here since I was alt-light, paleo-conservative, basically.
Yeah, basically, if you don't have to be a conservative to be against illegal immigration. It's called your just common sense. I follow, like I said, a lot of I follow a lot of center-left people on YouTube, and they all agree, yeah, there's no excuse for illegal immigration, and immigration into a country, for that matter, is not a right. A country has the choice to choose whether to let you in or not for any reason it deems necessary. So I probably would have agreed with you more on the IQ thing a few months ago, but upon hearing, I'd have to go a little bit into the channels I follow on YouTube. Do you follow any political channels on YouTube?
Well, I typically watch like American Renaissance every now and then, and also I've watched a few things from The Way the World. I still watch Rebel Media, though I've unsubscribed to it since like Lauren Southern and Gavin McInnes have left. And Ezra Levant seems to be like very ideologically intolerant. I mean, Israel is allowed to have a Jewish majority. Why can't we, as Americans, have a white majority?
Yeah, I have to say the Rebel Media doesn't necessarily treat the alt-right very fair, but to be honest, most people don't. But basically, there's been a huge upheaval in political YouTube. Namely, I guess you could say the skeptic community, if you will. You know, people like Sargon of Akkad, Crouten T, Mr. Medicare, Dr. Randomer Cam, Dr. Layman, you know, that guy T. This sort of loose association of atheists and agnostics who used to make videos on the idiotic, cringy, embarrassing internet Christians, but post Gamergate began taking on specifically the social justice left, you know, and their dogma. Most of the, I guess you could say, skeptic community is center left. You know, a lot of them are classical and or social liberals who are completely disgusted with what the left has basically become, you know, mainstream. And while they're not conservatives, they've given conservatives a second chance, and they've realized that maybe we weren't so crazy after all. That caveat aside, the skeptic community, one of the guys started in this crazed vendetta against the alt-right, namely against the claims of race realism, and made himself look like a total fool trying to do it because he was German, funnily enough. He went angry German on everything to give you, you know, sort of spurging out, I guess you could say, is the expression. And more and more, a lot of the center left started talking to the alt-right, you know, after decrying them as a bunch of racists for the longest time. And a lot of them jumped on board the race realism bandwagon, which is to say that IQ is largely genetic in nature, and that I will say I do think much of the alt-right takes the race realism stuff a little bit too far to say that our genetics are what build our culture. I'm not a biological determinist, so I don't subscribe to that idea. However, when even a lot of center leftist and center right people and libertarians that I follow started adopting race realism, I was like, okay, I got to start listening to these streams with these people. And there's this one libertarian scientist, this French-Canadian guy, Jean-François Galgapi. It's French. I don't speak French. Everyone calls him JF for short, you know, for Jean-François.
Jean-François?
Jean-François Galgapi. He has his own channel, and he actually has a doctorate. Like, this guy's an actual doctor. And he's explained race realism in great detail to say that race realism only talks about averages. You know, sure, we don't know the genes that cause intelligence per se. However, sociological research, the bell curve is the book they cite the most often. And I know Jared Taylor talks a lot about race realism too, that race is mostly, if not largely, genetic. Because it's kind of dumb to say that everybody's the same above the shoulders. You know, we're willing to say that certain diseases run in Jewish bloodlines. We're willing to say that certain diseases run in Hispanic or black bloodlines. You can tell what someone's race was based on the shape of their skull and their bones. doctors have to medicate people of different races differently because of different biochemistry. So basically, what race realism means is that there are biological differences in the races, and that can lead to average differences. It doesn't mean you have to throw away how you treat people on an individual basis. It just means that there are biological differences between the races, and intelligence is one of them. And from what I've seen, I haven't read the bell curve. I haven't read the bell curve. I know that's like the Bible for race realists, basically. But essentially, the bell curve is able to actually throw out a lot of other factors that could explain the difference in intelligence. It is able to show that poverty does not account for the difference very significantly. It shows any number of socioeconomic factors don't account for most of the difference. And I think the conclusion they came to is that somewhere around 50%, if not more, of intelligence is explainable through genetics. And again, it doesn't mean you have to throw out all differences or how you treat people, but essentially it somewhat explains why certain cultures became what they were. So for example, in order of IQ points, the people with the highest average IQ in the world are Ashkenazi Jews, who have an average IQ of about 120, which explains why you see so many Jews in entertainment, the arts, media. And Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about this, that there's also different kinds of intelligence, which is why you don't see as many Jews in, say, hard STEM subjects. Second place for IQ goes to East Asians, your Chinese, Japanese, Indian, etc. They have an average IQ of about 100. And you see a lot of East Asians in tech, in medicine, and just hard STEM subjects. But you don't see as many Asians in, say, media or the arts. Unless they're fine arts, they're really good at music. Then East Asians have like 100. Whites have an average IQ, non-Hispanic whites have an average IQ of like 90 something, 92, I think. Then Hispanics at about 80. Then blacks have an average IQ of about 70. And then near the very, very bottom, Australian Aboriginals and certain Pacific Islanders average IQ of about 62. Now, mental retardation is basically 60 and below. And you wonder why Australia is a desert. It's not because it's naturally a desert. It's because the Australian Aboriginal tribes, one of their hunting methods was to burn down entire forests and shoot at or spear animals that ran out of the flaming woods. Could you imagine doing that over and over again? Just constantly burning down forests? Is it any wonder why so much of Australia is a desert? So basically, it's kind of weird to have a white alt-right guy not be a race realist, and then the Hispanic non-alt-right guy is the race realist.
I'll need to check into this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I could probably link you to some streams. But it's funny because a lot of the people I followed were anti-race realism. They saw it as, scientific racism. Oh, this is only going to lead to scientific racism again. I'm like, I actually don't believe it will. I actually think that it's going to just take us back to square one with what do we do with society, because I could totally see Marxists, and social justice warriors, because it's like the gender pay gap, for instance. Now social justice warriors are saying, oh, okay, the pay gap isn't real because of oppression, but we need to get more women into STEM so that we do lessen the gap. It's like facts won't change these people's vendettas. I could totally imagine the social justice left saying, hey, let's race mix more to create higher IQ people and prop up these blacks, these Hispanics, these whatever. Otherwise you're a racist because you don't want them to succeed. I could totally see the social justice left co-opting race realism. I could also see race realism being beneficial, and say, hey, and finally be a good argument for, hey, let's stop trying to standardize education across the country. Let's cater education to specific high IQ or low IQ communities. Teach them in a way that works for them. Because as it stands, public school and even much of college doesn't prepare you for the real world anymore. And it's sorely been lacking, in my opinion, for preparing people for the real world. It still feels like the whole, it's made to pump out productive, obedient, conformant factory workers, when that's not the world we live in anymore. So that's my perspective on race realism, and it's a much newer one. A few months ago, I was against the concept of race realism, same as most other people. But upon hearing actual reasoned discussion about it, I think I can safely call myself a race realist. And yes, that's me, a brown person who might actually lose something from admitting to it if certain people get into power, which I don't think they will.
Well, that's pretty interesting. I'll need to look into this.
Yeah, I need to read The Bell Curve. That's the big book everyone's talking about, and the one that's always cited. Again, it's not to say you have to treat people differently. I don't go around looking at people as IQ numbers, and to be honest, I've met very few blacks that I didn't like. I've met people from all races that I like and that I don't like. I'll put it that way. It's just that living here on the border makes me sick of Hispanics, and it makes me wish I lived in a wider society. That's just me. Yeah, I bet you never thought you'd hear that one, did you?
That's funny. That's pretty funny.
Dude, I'm sorry, but Mexican culture is so overrated. It's not that great. It really isn't.
Oh, man.
Yeah, you won't necessarily hear a lot of brown people say that, so savor that little bit while you can. Oh, gosh. So, where do you think this fight with the radical, culturally Marxist left is heading? On the one hand, it seems like we might have reason for hope, because people are losing confidence in all the institutions that were sort of once held by the cult of social justice. Hollywood's failing, universities are being exposed, mainstream media is failing, people are turning more and more to alternative media or just not going to college at all. We have things like blockchain being implemented, cryptocurrency. Do we have hope for a truly decentralized future? Can we, as the culture warriors, no matter what banner we fly under, truly win?
I would say that yes, we do have a lot of hope, and under this decentralization, this is certainly an opportunity for individualization. Like, if you look at the history of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church and the clergy were basically the only ones, besides any very well-educated person, who had access to the Bible. And since Martin Luther was able to translate the Bible into German, and others translating the Bible into their own languages, this ended up giving the Bible to more and more people, and the printing press gave the ability to mass produce this text of the scriptures. And so thus, with YouTube getting out, or other video sites that people can share information on, basically we can easily see through the lies of the mainstream media. And basically, with anyone searching about anything, we can find anything in history or sources to certain historical aspects and debunk the lies that are certainly in academia. Heck, I was able to debunk so many lies in academia just by looking in history books without even going to the internet.
Well, there you go. There's a lot of still old on paper sources that debunk all sorts of crazy stuff. Like my last interview with the fascist guy, me and my friend Isaac, because I had my friend Isaac there to as part of the interview as well. Isaac brought up something, and by the way, he hates communists. Like he literally he wants another Pinochet to rise, and start throwing commies out of helicopters again. He hates commies that much. So my friend Isaac was telling me and our fascist friend about this massacre that the Soviet Union had in a forest, like mass graves. And the only reason why anyone knows about them is because one person who was shot at by firing squad didn't die and was able to crawl away and explain it. And it wasn't until like the 90s when like an actual memorial was erected to it. And people want to say that the Nazis were the worst thing ever.
Tell me about it.
I'm sorry, but fascists are not the worst people in history. Hitler wasn't even the worst person in history. I know, shocker, right? more racism. No. Joseph Stalin was also a big flaming racist, also a huge homophobe. And all you faggots wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, dude, Che Guevara hated stoners, he hated rockers, he hated gays, and he blamed the capitalist West for allowing degeneracy to flourish. Yeah, a communist. So don't go giving me this whole Hitler was the worst person in history. I'm sorry, but commies were the worst people in history. End of story. End of story. They should be thrown out of helicopters, and it's not murder because communists are not people. The South will rise again. Just kidding.
That's a funny point of view. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, trust me. There's a few of us red-pilled brown people down here. Not many, but you'll find us. I guess sort of in closing, what are some good books you'd recommend to me and the audience for reading, for better understanding your worldview? I mean, there was one you mentioned by Pat Buchanan. What was that one called?
Suicide of a Superpower. It even talks about the loss of Christian values and the end of white America as two major factors that have been killing America, as well as forced equality. And also, so much argument being used by Protestants against Catholicism, or by atheists against Christians, are the Crusades and Inquisition, when as a matter of fact, I would recommend The Crusades, a book by Thomas Asbridge, which he explains that Islam was violent from the beginning, while the violence gradually grew in Latin Christianity, and the Crusades were defensive wars, and how basically the Spanish Inquisition, much of the casualties were greatly exaggerated. Only around like 3,000 to 5,000 people were killed, but most of the casualties happened in the first stage, when sadly the victims were ex-Jews who had converted to Christianity, who happened to be Catholic, and basically it's because they were shunned by the Jewish community for accepting Yeshua, or Christ, as the Messiah. Basically, I could go on about different history books, but I would say any kind of history book, that book by James Patrick Buchanan, and also the Bible, which basically would definitely show my ideology.
Yeah, I think a lot of people could stand to read more of the Bible. It's a very pacifying book, and if you think the Bible is a totalitarian book, I dare you to read Romans chapter 14. It's going to sound almost like it's arguing for religious pluralism. I mean, it's not, but it's a passage that shocked me when I first read it. So Romans 14. So on to non-serious stuff. Do you drink?
You're asking if I drink?
Yeah.
Well, moderately. Basically, I do like a good taste of wine, or maybe an ale once in a while, but I do not like it in large quantities because I don't like the feeling that one gets when it's harder to focus or hazy. Plus, and I'm proud to say, though, that I've never gotten drunk in my life.
Yeah, my tastes are in I mean, I'll pretty much have anything you give me, but my tastes are in dark beers, dry red wines, and cocktails, especially margarita. That's margaritas and dark beers are my really big weakness. So, yeah, I just had to ask. That's always a question I like to ask my guests: is if they have any decent taste or have any recommendations for any unique drinks that they particularly like.
I really like an old Bordeaux.
There we go. What do you taste in music? I'm curious.
Well, I certainly like listening to different music from different cultures, like even different European cultures. I'm a huge fan of soundtracks.
Like movie and TV show soundtracks? Like orchestral ones? You froze up again.
Older, more traditional music types. Which is why when it comes to church, my favorite songs would be the hymns.
I missed probably the first half of that because there was a giant gap.
Oh, sorry. Anyways, I am definitely a traditional type, and which is why I even enjoy the hymns more so than I do the modern Christian music.
So you're more of a traditionalist in that sense.
Oh, yes.
I liked Christian music, but from like 2000 to like 2007-ish, and then after that, they kind of all started sounding the same. Like for the like that little period of time seemed like they were experimenting, trying new stuff, very unique, very distinct, and now they're all sort of sticking to like the same 5 styles, you know. So I can kind of feel you there. I have felt a little bit of a call to return a little more to the traditional or the old certain things. It's why I don't like modern pop, because it's all cookie cutter, sterile, and bland. And then I find myself listening to stuff from like the 40s. You know, I'm like, wow, where did this Americana stuff go?
Oh, man. And I really like your style. You and I see almost eye to eye culturally.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be appreciated in that which is old. I love classical music. I love soundtrack. Yeah, like you said, type stuff, orchestral stuff. I like video game music. And not just the orchestrated stuff, but even the old 8-bit or 16-bit stuff. Like I like the old, very limited MIDI sounds that they could pump out, because they had to get pretty creative, and they came out with some pretty catchy tunes, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, yes, I like some of that too.
Dude, Castlevania especially. It's always had the best music. Castlevania and Metroid.
I really liked the Halo theme myself.
That's another game on my laundry list of games to eventually get around to. I know it's one that everyone's played and everyone says is good, but I've not had the time or the console. I'll find a way to do it. Anyway, I won't take up any more of your time, but I'll just pronounce the acronym as MOP. But thank you for joining me today, man. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.